Hi, I'm Andy Tix, instructor at Normandale Community College, and this is IntroPsychSessions.
Welcome to IntroPsychSessions, Season 3. I'm your host, Garth Neufeld. In Season 2, I overhauled my Introductory Psychology class and chatted with a bunch of amazing teachers of psychology about the process. Then, some of you emailed me with questions or comments. So I invited you to take the intro psych discussion further. These are our conversations, and we hope you'll all enjoy Intro Psych Sessions Season 3.
All right, Andy, let's get into it. You emailed me a while back, and if I remember your email correctly, you said you were listening to Season 2. You said you were talking with some of your colleagues about it every once in a while, specific episodes. And then you told me about what you do in your class, which was really interesting to me. And so where do you want to start today? Do you want to start with Season 2? Do you want to start by telling me about your class? We can kind of go wherever we want.
Yeah, I have a memory actually. So I'm in Minnesota, and when your episodes dropped, it was among the most snowy winters in Minnesota recorded history. And I remember listening to your episodes as if I was listening to the best Netflix, watching the best Netflix program ever. So I looked back and I listened again to some of the old episodes, and I saw that I watched them, or I listened to them in progression, and in February and March. So yeah, I mean, I will go anywhere you want to.
Okay.
I can talk with you about, episodes or what I thought of what happened in Season 2, or I can talk about.
Let's do
class.
this. What prompted you to email me?
So I was fascinated by what you were doing for your sabbatical project. I was jealous. I wished I had come up with this idea, because you were developing your course while talking with some of the great experts in the field, and just kind of having open conversations about this course, which I've taught for over 20 years and many different iterations, and just love to teach. And I had not heard anything so directly relevant to just kind of going through the course systematically and thinking about how to teach that course. So I just was enjoying it, and I wanted you to know I was enjoying it. There were some broad themes that were interesting to me. The episode that most struck me was the one with Danae Hudson, because I think that was a little bit more process oriented, and I was interested in the discussion. Actually, you had this throughout the whole series, but in that episode especially, you were talking a lot about motivation and how motivation is so key to what we do with students. And there was a specific discussion where you were talking about pre-testing, and how, like if we're trying to have a flipped classroom, which I also try to do for the most part, it's really helpful if you're teaching a face-to-face course that the students would come somewhat prepared. And it's interesting to me how over the last 20 years, more and more people have adopted this pre-testing strategy. I remember when I first started teaching this course, I would do these informal surveys, and I think maybe about 1 in 4 students had done the reading before they came to class.
Yeah.
And that wasn't real conducive to having meaningful discussions during the class. So I was grappling with a lot of the same issues. And where I settled with that was that there was sort of a couple options. So one was you don't do any kind of pre-work. You don't require pre-work.
Yeah.
Another is you have them pre-test. And I have not done that, because it feels like then, and you talked about this in that episode, the students will do the bare minimum necessary in order to be able to complete the multiple choice questions. So if they have to look at bolded words or whatever in the textbook in order to do the multiple choice questions, that's what they do. And so they are more prepared when they come to class. But like, if I put myself in the position of a student doing that, I would think it feels kind of just an instrumental motivation. Like I just have to get this done.
Yeah.
It would take away some of my natural interest probably in the concepts. And I come from sort of some research background on intrinsic motivation. And so when I was thinking about that, I thought, I wish we could figure out a way to decrease the emphasis on these quizzes. So around that time, I read a chapter by Peter Gray, who, was one of the old classic textbook authors. And he was talking about having a question-centered course. And that struck me. And so what I've done in my Intro to Psych course to a large extent is I've tried to make it question-centered. So toward the beginning of the course, I assign this TED Talk by Stuart Firestein, who's a neuroscientist, and he talks about ignorance, the value of ignorance, and how if you go to a conference and you're out having a beer afterwards with your colleagues, similar to what we're doing, Garth, except we don't have a beer, we're talking about what we don't know.
Yeah.
That's where the action is. We're not talking about what we do know. We're talking about what we don't know.
That's right.
And that's where you learn something.
Yeah.
And so I assign them that. And then throughout the course, instead of having them do pre-testing, I give them their assignments, like the chapter to read or a TED Talk to watch or a podcast to listen to or whatever. And they have to prepare their best questions for the next class. And many times then during class, we will discuss those questions in different kinds of ways. I might put them into a group, and then the group members will discuss their best questions, and then they have to pick their best question. And then I give them kind of ownership over the room, and I say, you go to the whiteboard and somebody write the best question you've come up with, either something that an individual student had or something you came up together with as a group. And then we look at them and we talk about them. And part of the course then is about what makes for a really good question. And I orient the topics around questions. So we have 4 questions we discuss in the course, which is how we know what we know, how can students thrive in school, why do we do what we do, and how can we be happy? And I always bring up the question, like, what's the question of the day? They bring up their questions. At the end of the semester, part of their final exam is that they have to then kind of sort through what they think is remaining their best question, and they have to defend it, and they have to say what they learned related to it, and they have to say what they would do to further explore it, or what kind of research study could further explore it, given kind of what they know in the course. And I think there are limitations to this too. And I'd be curious what you think, because I'm ignorant about how to teach after all these years too. But it does seem like it has some advantages over pre-testing, because I think even if the students just skim through the book and look at the topics and come up with some questions, I would rather have them thinking about what they're curious about coming into a class, rather than just looking at bolded terms or whatever they have to do multiple choice questions.
Yeah, it seems like it is like a deeper level of processing to ask students to come up with questions. I actually really, really like it, Andy. It's but I find myself, before we start talking about it, let me just ask you, can you give me an example of the kind of question that a student might come up with, or that students might come up with? And is it like, so you're going to give them, like, you'll say, read this chapter on memory, and then I want you to start developing some questions? Or is that how it kind of goes? It's related to content. Right? It's
related to the content they're assigned for that class session where they're bringing their question.
So is it like wide open? It can be a broadly, like a philosophical question. Does it have to be an empirical question? Is it related to a particular concept or theory? Like, how do you instruct them around that?
Well, it has to be related to the content. And I tell them that there are 3 kinds of questions that could be asked. One is questions related to what they don't understand, which actually is not a very common question. So, like, in other words, they read through the chapter and they just don't get something.
Yep.
Most of the time that doesn't happen, because our textbook authors are pretty good writers.
Right.
And as long as they try, like, they probably aren't too confused. A second kind of question is where they sort of don't believe it. Like they've heard something different elsewhere, or they've always had this hunch, or they've had a different experience. And so then they're coming across some new information, like, they read about how learning styles isn't maybe a real thing or doesn't really predict performance in school as much as they've heard in high school. And then they can say, well, I heard this in high school, or I've always thought that. And so that leads me to a question, so it's something like that. Or a third kind of question is, and this is probably the most common, where they're asking about something that is on topic, but just was never addressed. So like for whatever reason, it just wasn't covered. A common example, a really good question would be, we're learning about this topic. Is this really true in other places in the world? Or is this really just true in this culture? Like that would be a really good question.
Yeah.
And then I will take their question. I'll take the best questions and I'll show them the best questions, and we can talk about like what makes for a good question. And all this is motivated by the sense that a lot of students come into college without much intrinsic motivation or curiosity. Like I think they started elementary school with a lot of intrinsic motivation and curiosity, and somehow along the way they lost it. And now they're coming to us. They're pretty instrumentally motivated. They're focusing on points and grades and getting a degree and getting a job, which is all understandable. And we want them to get a degree, and we want them to get a job, and we want them to be self-sufficient. But I guess one thing that I value is that they also reconnect with what they're interested in and curious about. And like you said, I do think that does help with learning. In fact, I mean, this is a sort of deep processing strategy.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's great. So then your students come to class. I'm sure that the quality of these questions really is quite variable, right?
Absolutely.
And so you're training them on how to ask good questions, and probably that affects the way that they read and process things. So I really like that. Now, what are you having? Are they doing this? Have you attached credit to it? Are you grading this?
It's part of what I call a course journal.
Okay.
So they're keeping these. I'm kind of randomly giving them feedback through the term. And then at the end of the semester, they submit the whole thing for grading, which includes an overall reflection on kind of the process. And typically what students will say is in the very beginning of the course, their questions were shallow. They were doing it just to get the points, but as they kind of went through and they saw the relevance to what we were doing in class, they found that their questions got deeper. Sometimes they'll pull out a question then and say, "This is one I was really interested in." So they're kind of hopefully practicing some metacognitive skills and thinking about their questions also at the end. And then, like I said, the final exam includes an evaluation of kind of their best self-selected question for the term.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I want to get back to the journal because I'm going to introduce a journal with my
okay. Yep.
Yeah. So I don't know if I talked about that in season 2. Did I ever mention that? I don't think so. I don't think so.
I'm fascinated by journals, and there's a lot of different ways you could do journals.
Yeah. Talk to me about what else you have students doing in that journal. Is that it?
For the most part, this is it. I do have them do some in-class writing, so that's part of it also. But for the most part, it's this question assignment. And you asked about grading. Really, they're just getting points for doing it along the way, and it's not worth many points. Yeah. And then at the end, I give them an overall grade, sort of based upon whether they did it. But then I also look more seriously at their end of the semester reflection.
Right. So, I did have a question. Hold on. Where's my question? So, the journal is electronic. It's a physical journal. What are you having them do? How are you
in a face-to-face class? I prefer it if they actually print it, because What I found in the past is if they could do it handwritten, they would just scratch out something right before I collected it, and it was just not very quality. But if I make them type it, it seems like they put more thought into it, and then I have them print it so that they have access to it. They could also show it to me, like if they have a computer that they're using in class, they could show it to me, because somehow or other they have to be able to access the question.
Yeah.
Online, I'll do something similar where there's a discussion board and they're doing something like this too, but at some point we should talk about online asynchronous courses and some of the pros and cons of that, because sometimes I don't know if that translates as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you teach asynchronous courses as well, but you haven't had as much success, you think, with the question strategy?
Well, the strategy really works well in a face-to-face course, because then, it's pretty typical in a given week where I'm with the students for 4 hours in that week. It's pretty typical that part of that week will be looking at some of their questions for a half an hour, 45 minutes. So it's much more intense. Whereas online, they see other people's questions, and I can pull out like a student question of the week and highlight that and respond, but they don't get that in-depth discussion. So I don't know if they pick it up as well.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to get back to that, because when a student comes up with a question, if you address a few questions in your class time with students for 30, 45 minutes or whatever it is, what are you doing? Because you obviously can't be an expert on all their questions, right? So what are you doing with them with those questions? Are you answering those? Are you crowdsourcing it and saying, everybody get online, let's go look into this?
I say I don't know a lot.
Uh-huh.
A lot of the questions are not easily answered. So it sometimes happens where someone asks a question that I do know the answer to, so I feel good about that. Sometimes the question I know might have been answered somewhere in the discipline, but I just don't know the answer. So that's where I might say, hey, I bet that's a question that's been answered. Somebody pull out their phone and see what you can find while we're looking up this other, or I'll pull it up on the screen and I'll just type it, and we'll just talk about what I'm doing and what kind of sources I'm using at the time.
Okay.
But a lot of times the questions are not easily answered, and I'll say, this is a question that I don't think has been answered. I wonder how we would answer it.
There you go. Yeah.
And then we talk about, if it's a researchable question, we can talk about that. If it's not a researchable question, then I'll say, well, this is really an interesting question. It's really more philosophy than psychology, and here's the difference, which is also good for them to know kind of the limitations of the discipline.
Yeah. It really does get at some important psychological knowledge kind of through the back door. Right?
Through the back door, and they're sort of pulled into it without knowing what I'm doing. So a lot of times a student might say to me, I learned so much through this course, but I don't really know when we ever talked about this. It's sort of like it's there. And then my colleagues always joke with me and they say, well, Andy, you don't actually teach. Like because a lot of it's just discussion.
Yeah.
And it sort of comes through the discussion. It's a lot about process and these little finer points that add up over the course of a term.
Yeah, it's one of the great things about doing somewhat of a flipped classroom is that, if students are taking the time, if you can motivate them to read and do some reflection before they get into class, they can understand a lot of it. Like I use an interteaching method where I have students answer questions before they come to class. Mm-hmm. It's amazing what they get after a first run through, like a first read through of the book. Well, they only read it once really, but when they read it, that they can get basically the right answers for some pretty kind of in-depth questions. Now, there are predictable things like cognitive dissonance that they're going to struggle with, right?
Right.
And so I know where those things are now after having taught as long as you have in the classroom. But
there are some predictable questions, though. Like
certainly,
it's pretty predictable. They're going to be confused by classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and certain research methods, and figuring out what's true. Just generally, so then I can use that knowledge to also inform what I'm planning for the other parts of the lessons.
Well,
so over time, I kind of figure out okay, they really do need more of this.
I could see you using those questions as a jumping off point. Classical conditioning is tough. Somebody's going to ask some question. Somebody's going to bring a question in that maybe loosely has to do with classical conditioning, a story about it or something like that. And then you can use that as a jumping off point, right?
Right.
Like you could almost, whatever you want to teach in class or whatever misconceptions you want to, address, you could probably do it all through your questions that students are bringing in. Is that true?
I don't know if I would. It's interesting to think about how much structure or lack of structure we want to have in our courses. I would want a little bit more structure and plan than that. I mean, the question discussions is sort of planned chaos, planned just open inquiry.
Sure.
And so, like, I know for that amount of time, we're going to be spending time wherever the students are at with it.
So then,
but then I also want to move on and
And how does that moving on? How does that moving on happen? Is it okay? Well, we're done. Thanks for bringing your questions. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit specifically about classical conditioning. Is that how you do it?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's a break. Like I'll say, okay, so let's take a little break, and then when we come back, so because I don't want it to seem odd how we're connecting all of this. But let's say I have the students' questions on the board, and I address in some way, 5 of the 8 that are on the board. And this is with a small class too. My capacity is like 45.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly how you do this in a class of 300.
Right.
But let's say there's 3 if I know what's coming in the rest of the week, I can leave the question up and I'll say, okay, I was planning on coming back to this question, and this question is related to now what we're going to do here. Right. And it does have a nice sense to it in that the students know it's connected to something that one of them brought up, even though it was part of the plan.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm just pushing stuff onto them.
Yeah. Yeah. So what does the rest of your class look like? So after the question period, are you lecturing? Are you doing activities?
It's a blend. I do a lot of activities. I have a lot of discussions. I try to pose questions back to them. Like I'll say, based on Firestein's TED Talk, I'll say, these are questions that I'm ignorant about based upon what we're covering. Mm-hmm. And what do you think about that? And then we'll have a discussion either, and I might have them write about it first, or I might have them in small groups, or we might have just I try to mix that up. And sometimes I'll have a lecture, because sometimes, especially with, and this is something that was discussed in your interview with Danae, I think post 2020, a lot of our students are coming to us less prepared for college.
Yeah.
And I think a flipped model works better with students who are capable of learning on their own. And I think a flipped model works less well when the students kind of don't know how to read as well.
Yeah.
Or can't comprehend it. And so then they think they need more of the structure of a lecture. So I have moved actually a little bit more toward lecture.
Yeah.
But trying to mix it up, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Well, Andy, we are, if you can believe it, we're about out of time. But one of the things that I appreciate that we talked about was this idea of just another way of how to motivate students and organize a class session. I think it's your idea of organizing around questions is really interesting to me, because it's going to make students curious, and curiosity, I think, is a skill that we can help students to learn, and so that's what it does. Do you have any kind of final thoughts or anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
Well, if it seems overwhelming to design a whole course around this idea, one thing that people could do is just to try it.
Yeah.
Like you could have a class, even though it's not part of the normal structure of the course, you could have a class session where you just say, hey, let's take a couple minutes and have you think about what you're curious about and do what I do and see how it goes. And you could just do it one time and see how it goes.
Yeah, it's great.
And see. I've sometimes kind of guest taught in people's classes because they're sick or whatever, and that's what I do.
Sure.
And it's just it's very refreshing. If nothing else, it's a change in course.
Yeah, another thing I like, you as an instructor, you obviously are a skilled facilitator if it's working for you. And I think that's actually one of the things that I want to emphasize in my own teaching. I want to facilitate learning.
Yeah.
I want to be the architect of learning. I know we do this. I know that we should be doing this, but I really want to step into that role. It sounds like you have as well, where we're going to create a learning environment with the questions we ask, with the activities that we do,
Yeah, it's interesting to think of the metaphor here. A curator comes to mind.
Yeah.
Or a camp counselor where you're gathering them around a fire.
Sure. Yeah.
In a circle.
Yeah.
I don't know. That'd be another episode to think about different metaphors.
Yeah. Catalyst is one I like as well. I do. By the way, just a final thought that we won't have any time to talk about because we're just up against the clock. But you mentioned online teaching versus face-to-face. I didn't. With all the reflection I did after season 2, I just realized I was only talking about my face-to-face course. I didn't know that when I started. I thought I was talking because I teach hybrid, teach online asynchronous, and I teach face-to-face. And I thought I was overhauling all of my courses, and I think they will all be affected. But I realized that the conversations we were having in season 2 were really for face-to-face.
Sure.
They don't roll over super well to online asynchronous courses. And then I was like actually looking at my asynchronous online course, and I was thinking, which I'm teaching right now this summer, and I was like, I'm really happy with it. But it's not related. It's just a different thing, right? So
it is a different thing.
Yeah.
But it'd be what a wonderful idea if we could get some people together, such as in another season, and really explore how to do an online asynchronous course well.
Yeah, Andy, we're gonna have to circle back to that. It's a great idea. So maybe that's season 4. Hey, I want to thank you for coming.
Oh, this is super fun and good to be connected.
Yeah, please keep in touch. Okay.
Yeah, likewise. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.